How's this? Can you hear all right? Thank you very much, Miriam and Alliance for Action. I'm delighted to be here. My name is Alison Jones, and like many of you, my political philosophies have changed over the course of my life. We all start out just parroting what our parents are saying, and then we start to learn and we start to grow. And over the years, I've become increasingly more progressive, and it's not just because it's the humane and kind philosophy, although it is that. I've come to the conclusion after a lot of reading and research that it really is the economically responsible way to go. I'm a scientist. I'm not an economist, although I have worked in the economic fields periodically. But I think what I've pulled together here today is something any one of us could have done. You go to reputable websites, think tanks, you look at their basic data, and any one of you could have come up with these conclusions. The conclusions that I'm going to show you today, if you're progressive, you probably intuitively knew what I'm going to say, but I'm going to show you the facts behind it. I love this slide because what it really shows is what progressivism is, a force for equity and fairness. The great progressive movement that occurred between about 1890 and 1920 gave us some wonderful things. It gave us child labor laws, it gave us the weekend, it gave us collective bargaining, and out of it, we got the strongest middle class this world has ever seen. But in the 50 or so years following that movement, we've seen the middle class slowly weakening. That progressive movement in the early 1900s was not perfect. It left behind brown and black people. Let's just say it for what it is. It wasn't perfect. But as we go into a new progressive movement, and I think we're doing that now, we need to strive for a more inclusive one. So let's talk about the progressive message. These are all things progressives stand for. It's not everything. And let's see how conservatives respond to each one of these. I'm going to call them regressives in this talk. So to a living wage, regressives will say small business can't afford it. Pro-labor, labor kills jobs. Healthcare is a right. We can't afford that. Humane immigration policy. Immigrants will steal our jobs. They'll cost money to educate. Environmental stewardship, that's burdensome on business. Strong public education, let's privatize it and give vouchers. Access to higher education, well, we can't afford that. Safety net programs, can't afford those. Social Security, unsustainable. Human dignity, it's not the government's job. Plus, we can't afford it. Now, I think you can see a theme here. And it's the economy, stupid. I grew up in southern Louisiana, and James Carville, who was Clinton's political strategist, is still there. I always liked his straight talk, and this was a sign on Clinton's desk at one time. It is the economy, stupid. Everything that the regressives hate about progressivism, or almost everything they hate about, has to do with money. Not everything. We have the Second Amendment, for example. But so it's time for progressives to reframe our message. And this is what I do in every talk. I give you the conclusion first. And this is where everything I'm going to be speaking about today is pointed. Progressive values are not only compatible with sound economic policy, they make good economic policy. So let's look at some facts. We are Democrats. We are the party of facts. And as I was researching this talk, I went to a lot of white papers on various think tank websites. I realized that some of those can be skewed, either progressive or conservative. But what I did was I went back to the basic data. I went back to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. I went back to the census data, and I confirmed a lot of this. And I used some sources that I knew were reputable. This is something we all have to do these days. So let's first start by debunking some of the ideas that regressives are telling us are fact. And this is the big one. It all has to do with supply side. Do tax cuts help the economy? And this, of course, is the conservative fantasy. This is what they want you to believe. This is what all the conservative politicians say they believe, although I don't really think they believe it. And of course, note the data on this chart are not real. So what they are telling us is growth rate will go down as the top marginal tax rate goes up. This is what they've been telling us since the late 60s, early 70s. But it's not true. Here are the real facts. Here's some plots from the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities. These data actually come from the Tax Policy Data Center. And every dot on this chart, these are sort of come together, represents a year in the post-war economy from 1947 to 2015. And this plots the real per capita GDP growth versus the top marginal tax rate. Again, if the conservative fantasy were true, the best fit regression line would go like this. But that's not what we see. We see that there is actually no correlation between real per capita GDP growth and the top tax rate. This regression line, this best fit line, looks slightly up. Statistically, it's flat. It could be up or down. But we don't see the correlation that conservatives are telling us we would see. Let's look at the same years, 1947 to 2015. This is employment growth versus the top marginal tax rate. Again, look at this. There is no correlation between employment growth and the top tax rate. Exactly what they're not telling us. Again, we can look at productivity for non-farm business sector, same years, 1947 to 2015. The best fit line is here. The conservatives would tell you it should go like this. Again, no correlation. And finally, let's look at the real median family income growth versus the top marginal tax rate. Conservatives would tell you the line should go like this, slanting down to the right. It doesn't. There's no negative correlation, and in fact, there's a slightly positive correlation. So I think it's pretty clear. We're told that trickle-down economics works like this, but it doesn't. What really happens is it's working like this. And this was a meme I got off the internet, and it's actually even more accurate than I think they meant it to be, because what happens is as this glass gets bigger, this becomes a very unstable situation. What really, progressive policies encourage recirculation of money, and conservative policies encourage hoarding of money. And that's the difference. It's all about recirculation, spending. It's demand side, not supply side. So let me go further. So this is a good time for me to talk about some of the differences between progressive and regressive economic policies or principles. So progressives believe in an economic policy that is about fairness. Regressives believe that it should be about freedom from government interference. But the fact is, the economy has never been free of government interference. It regulates It has regulations to protect employees, stockholders, competing businesses. The government inspects food and drugs. It sets safety standards. It regulates pollution. And if conservatives were really concerned about freedom from government interference, they would be railing against market distortions caused by government subsidies and preferences. They would be railing against sweetheart contracts, skewed trade agreements, the fine print that prevents people from suing companies. But they are not really for that, only when it benefits them. So the next thing is, progressives believe that the economy is powered by low and middle income working Americans, and we believe in rewarding work, not wealth. Conservatives believe in supply side or trickle down that rewards wealth, not work, and I've shown you already that that just doesn't work. And finally, progressives believe that real wealth comes from the creation of products and services. And regressives' economic policy really exploits tax and regulatory loopholes. It socializes risk and it privatizes profit. Not all wealth is the same. Today, an enormous amount of our economy is based on banking and Wall Street. And these don't really create anything. They have a role, but they make their money by moving money around and taking a little piece of it every time. They create these derivative investments that no one really understands. And in the end, there's nothing created. It's an economy built on phony wealth, and what we need to do is promote fair markets that create real goods, services, and products. And by the way, when you do that, you employ more people and spread it around. It's about recirculation of money. So I'm going to now touch on a bunch of topics that support this claim, my conclusion that progressive economic policies are sound economic policies. And we're going to talk about all sorts of things. The first one we're going to look at is K through 12 spending per student. This is a graph prepared by the National Education Association. And we can see that there's a high correlation between high spending and low poverty. Each one of these dots represents a state in the United States. By the way, just so you see, here's Arizona. And you can see that the high poverty states are all low spending states. Now there's these freak states in here, as I call them, like Utah, in which they have low poverty and low spending. There's a reason for that, and I'll show you later. But what these states tell you is there's more than one way to bring people out of poverty. In fact, Utah spends a whole lot on other social programs, and that's the reason why. But, so high spending on education has considerable benefits for the economy, and it really does lower poverty. Let's look at this graph. It's pretty complicated, but this shows every county in the United States. Every dot represents a county. And this is the percentage of the population with a bachelor's degree or higher and the median individual income. And there's just such a strong correlation between the median individual income and the amount of the degree of education. Here, by the way, is Pima County right there. So this is a very strong correlation, and presumably it's bidirectional. And by that, what we mean is the more educated a populace is, the more economic potential the county has. And the more economic potential a county has, the more it draws educated workers. So this sort of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I've always thought that if a state can commit to fully educating one generation, that well-educated generation is going to make their kids want to become more educated, and it becomes sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. But the alternative is, once a state gets stuck in poverty, it's really hard to drag itself out of that poverty, and they've got to spend more money on it to make it happen. So let's look at another phenomenon, the social spending. Each dot here represents a country in the Office for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD. And we're plotting the percent of social spending from the public sector versus the wealth inequality. The higher you go up here, the more wealth inequality there is. We are just almost off the chart here. And the way they figure this is they just put a ratio of the median to the mean income. If a country had a ratio of 1, everyone would be making the same, basically. And we're not saying that that should be the case, but this degree of income inequality is way out of whack. So what this graph shows is that countries that spend for education and healthcare through their taxes, rather than through insurance companies and student loans, have radically less inequality. And often those countries achieve more by spending less. Let's take an example. The US spends about almost $15,000 per person in social spending. Only $9,400 of that is managed through the government. The rest is through private entities like student loans or health insurance even. In Finland, which is down here, I believe, people pay about $2,000 more in taxes, but they get about $5,000 more in benefits. And all of that money is handled by the government. The bottom line is this, and we've got to get people over the government is bad mindset. When the takeaway here is that when social spending is managed by the government, the opportunity it creates is available to everyone. But when it is through student loans, for example, or private entities, the level of opportunity a child has is more related to the wealth of their parents. It's just an issue of fairness. Let's look at another graph. This is cash safety net programs per capita versus the poverty rate. And each one of these dots is a state. Again, here is Arizona. And it's a common belief among conservatives that the more you spend, per capita, the higher the poverty rate you'll have. And they think this because they're going to be encouraging dependency. This absolutely is not the case. What we can see is that the low spending states, again, like that education graph, the low spending states have high poverty. The high spending states have low poverty. And here's New Hampshire and Vermont here. They're both low spending and low poverty because they spend a lot on education. So you gotta take these into account. So we can see here, first of all, that cash safety net programs actually do work. And there was a recent article in Politico about that. It said something like, safety net programs actually help people. And I was like, hasn't that always been the assumption? Well, we thought it was, but a lot of people are really surprised by that. This is also important. To some extent, lifting people out of poverty pays for itself. The poverty rate is calculated on a pre-tax, pre-welfare benefit basis. And what that means is that as more people rise out of poverty, they make more income, so they pay more taxes, and that offsets the cost of lifting them out of poverty. Let's take another program, an example of progressive programs, and that's homelessness. Homelessness is very expensive to all of us. The average homeless person costs the government $40,000. And about half of that is emergency room spending. This is nationally.
Per year?
Yeah, per year. Per year. And it's because they're incurring $22,000 a year in ER costs. More than a decade ago, New Yorker magazine had an article about a homeless fellow they called $1 Million Murray. And he was in and out of the hospital constantly. And so if we can supply supportive housing to these folks, we can virtually eliminate that ER cost, the biggest part of the cost of homelessness. And it's happening. There's a pilot program in Texas, of all states, where this is working. And they're trying to keep the funding up. This fellow here just could not keep up with his medications living on the street. And people were robbing him to take his medications. And so he was in and out of the ER constantly. This is a no-brainer. It pays for itself. Plus, it's humane, if that means anything to you guys. It means something to me. Healthcare and housing experts have long known that keeping people off the streets is a great way to reduce costs. So let's talk now about labor. This graph shows how union membership correlates to median household income, not just of union members, but of everybody. And the orange markers represent right-to-work states or anti-labor states, and the green dots represent more union-friendly states. And the blue line represents the average relationship. So in the right-to-work states, the orange state, the average median household income is $49,414 a year. In the in the labor states, $56,000. It's about 12% higher for everyone, not just the union members. And the reason is because, again, let's go back to circulation. Union members, they're not sending their money to offshore bank accounts. They're spending it. They're spending it in the community. They are recycling their money. And generally, even in the states with the highest number of union members, it's rarely more than 20%. So it doesn't even take a huge number of union members to lift the whole population. Let's take another look. Let's look at climate change. Oh, I wanted to say one more thing about unions. Did you know that union members also have higher success in their marriages? They don't divorce at such high rates. And the reason is pretty simple. They just don't face the same financial pressures other people do. And you can blame divorce rates on a lot of different things, but very often it comes back to money stressors. Even I gave this talk at Progressive Democrats of Southern Arizona, and they even said physical abuse is often tied to money pressures.
Wow.
So you can't downplay the importance of that. Let's talk about climate change and environmental stewardship. Progressives believe that we need to implement changes now to mitigate it. Regressives say it's too expensive, or they say it's not happening at all. This map is from Science Magazine very recently, and it's plotting the damage function, they call it, the damage function on the GDP of all these different counties. These are all counties. And this is, by the end of this century, if we don't do anything to mitigate climate change. They ran computer models of various factors, including the economy, crime, agriculture, health, energy demand, labor, and this is the damage function they came out with. And there are some counties that will have economic damage of 30% of their GDP. Yes, there are some places that will actually benefit from climate change, but overall, it's going to be a big expense for this nation and everybody. And this is important. It will affect poor people the most. It's much cheaper to mitigate now than to pay the price later. And because it impacts poor people more, we will become increasingly polarized as far as wealth inequality. You all know this, so I'll just touch on it briefly. Healthcare, it's a no-brainer. We're spending about 18% of our GDP on healthcare. Other countries in the OECD are spending about 10%. This is from The Economist magazine. America is the healthcare outlier in the developed world. If you're not familiar with The Economist, it's fantastic. It's published in Great Britain. And they're laughing at us when it comes to healthcare. They just don't understand why we don't get it. Let's talk about family values. There's a financial nexus here. Conservatives have often thought they own this topic, but they really don't. As it turns out, progressive economic policies are good for families, and strong, stable families are good for the economy. So there was a study done by, I believe it was the Brookings Institute, and they looked at states that have progressive policies. They looked for states that had laws related to living wages. They looked at states that had strong collective bargaining. They identified the states that expanded Medicaid, and they identified states that had supported reproductive rights. And what they found was really fascinating. States that met all four of these criteria were much, much better off. Those states had 28% lower divorce rates, and they had 32% lower infant mortality rates. They had 50% lower rates of births to teenagers, and 17% lower rate of children that were not living with either one of their parents. These states also had higher educational attainment and lower incarceration rates. The conclusion: progressive policies promote strong, healthy families.
Excuse me, could you tell us how many states that is that met all four of those criteria?
I will have to look that up. It's less than 20.
Okay, I was thinking that was a lot.
Yeah. And this was done in 2014, by the way. They used 2014 data. Again, continuing on the family values track here, this was a study done by the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, which showed that social spending that actually gave families money, extra money, it can be in the form of vouchers, helped low-income children succeed over the long term. And the reason is very simple. Well, first of all, their conclusions were the success of an individual right now is highly dependent on the parents to whom you're born. Severe poverty-related stress has lasting consequences for children. And this was a study done at Harvard that showed when a child lives in an economically stressed household, and that means the parents aren't home much because they're working several jobs, or they don't have regular meals, they don't have easy ways to get to school, or they might even be living in a dangerous neighborhood. All of these things cause in children something that Harvard identified as toxic stress. And it actually affects the growth and functioning of a child's brain. It makes them less able to learn, and it affects their social and emotional skills that take them into adulthood. So just by doing some very simple things, providing some income support can improve a child's long-term outcome. It turns out that it's a little money that pays off big benefits. These programs have long-term benefits, including improved health, higher school attendance, raises reading and math scores, it increases high school completion, college entry, it lifts the lifetime income, and it extends longevity. This is an example of what just giving a household a housing voucher so they can move into a better, safer neighborhood will do. It increases a child's adult earnings, college attendance, and it reduces incidences of single parenthood, which is a financially stressful situation, and usually it's worse on women than men. And SNAP, that's today's food stamps. Children who have access to that have lower incidence of stunted growth. This is into adulthood. Lower heart disease in adulthood, lower obesity in adulthood, and much higher high school completion. So the bottom line from this study was that the long-term effect of government assistance provides a lifetime of benefits. And these children, when they become adults, are productive, they're paying taxes instead of living on the street or taking advantage of future benefits. It really is an investment in the future. And for that reason, I would say that progressive values are traditional American values. Strong, healthy families are good for the economy. Now, about a year ago, I was actually thinking about running for Congress. I was thinking about running for CD2. And I took the Democratic Party's candidate training class. It was really interesting. I would encourage you all, if you ever have some time on your hands, to take classes like that, even if you have no intention of running for office. Because you learn a lot about communication and what is important to people. And what we learned was that facts raise eyebrows and stories change minds. So what I have told you today is pretty wonky, technical stuff. You know, I'm not going to change minds by going to a GOP meeting and showing them these graphs. You guys are a friendly audience, you're open to it. So we need to change. This would not be the message. This talk I just gave you would not be the message we would take to the public in general. But what we'd have to do is change our messaging. And we have to say things, we don't need to say free markets and free enterprise. We need to be using verbiage like fair markets, level playing field, rigging the rules, gaming the system, stacking the deck, and an economy that works for all of us. And we need to be giving examples of those. We can't just be talking about job creators and supply side. We need to be saying we need to grow from the middle out, not the top down. Trickle down's a great terminology, we should be using that. We should be talking about the disappearing middle class, which is one of the root causes of our issues today. Unfair tax breaks, bailouts to Wall Street and giant corporations, and an economic system that is not working for the 99%. And we need to recognize that not all earnings are the same. As I said earlier, as progressives, we understand that we need to create real wealth with an honest day's work. We need to get rid of the economic predators and Wall Street speculators, rigging, cheating, churning loopholes. We need to reward work, not wealth. So I'll come back to my conclusion. Progressive values are not only compatible with sound economic policy, they make good economic policy. I suspect many of you knew this already. Now you have the facts. I would love to give this talk to anyone who will listen. I'm really glad it's being videoed here today. But if your brother-in-law wants to meet me at Starbucks, I'll bring my laptop and give him this talk. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I'm really grateful.